Andrew, thank you so much for being on the podcast and joining us to talk about your fantastic new book on helping parents mentor and guide their transgender teens. So thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
So before we jump in, I wonder if you can share a little bit about your work as a psychotherapist, as an author, educator, and consultant to help gender expansive youth.
Yeah, so I'm a psychotherapist. I'm in private practice these days. I also consult and train for companies, organizations, schools to better serve trans clients and students. And I write. My current projects, as you said, my recent book, Parenting Your Transgender Teen, just came out actually yesterday, the 8th. And I'm also working on a project for another publisher called the Gender Deck, which is kind of a therapeutic card deck for therapists, teachers, groups, students, basically any kind of group of two or more people to use to have conversations about gender. So that's another thing I'm really excited about.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I love that you are developing a deck to kind of gamify and make those conversations a little bit more intentional and more conversational. Because I feel like whenever we talk about sexuality or gender, those are very sensitive topics. And sometimes, especially as parents, we may not be sure how to even approach it. And my first question for you actually is, for a lot of parents, we might struggle even talking about sex with our children, and we may even be forgetting to talk about gender with our children. Can you talk about like some appropriate ways to bring it up with our kids?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of cases you could just be straightforward. I mean, I don't think you necessarily even need to have a lead in. I mean, I think the most important thing for kids to know is, just on a very basic level, is number one, that trans people exist, and number two, that, that it's okay to be trans. I mean, obviously there are a lot of nuances to that. There's a lot of information that, kids need to know beyond that. And, you can guide them to those more like expert sources of information, the sort of like websites, books, you know, TV, movies, things like that. But really, I mean, I always stress that, no matter whether parents think their kid is trans or could be trans, it's important for kids to just know about like the existence of like regular old trans people in the world. So, I mean, I would say, it's good to have like media with trans people in it, media with some form of gender diversity, to have positive portrayals of trans people, because one of the things that I talk about a lot with my adult clients, particularly those who are, around my age, who are in their 30s and or older, is that they just had nothing, when they were younger. I was actually just talking with a friend who just came out as non-binary, and this friend grew up in rural Romania and just had absolutely no idea that, being trans was even a thing that a person could be, or that there were like, happy trans people just, chilling out there. And I certainly growing up had very little idea beyond just, seeing joke trans characters in movies, these sorts of like comic figures that would appear in a TV show and in like a wig and heels and get a laugh and then leave. So I mean, I guess, my main message is like, have some, counter to that, because they're going to get like negative trans portrayals or jokes about trans people or gender everywhere they turn. So it's important to have some kind of like realistic, positive trans story in your home.
For the parents listening in who are maybe getting a sense that their child or their teen is trans, what are suggestions for you on how to approach their teen or their youth?
About the possibility that they might be trans, or about gender.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think for the parents maybe that are sensing that they might be trans, but maybe afraid to come out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sense of positivity is important. Even if the kid is not ready to even talk about these subjects, even if they're like cringing from, any, because, you may be in a situation where like you would be an affirming parent, if your kid would only tell you what was going on, but they may not be in a place where they can tell you. I mean, number one, obviously, like the uh, the affirming part of things, just saying positive things about trans people in the world, having positive portrayals of trans people. Uh, Number two, I think respecting boundaries. Being somebody who will ask about how they're doing, but not necessarily like pry into their private life. Allowing them to have that sort of space, privacy. Have their own friends, have space away from you. Uh, and I'm sure a lot of parents sort of might balk at that because it's kind of like well, if I'm not asking about this stuff directly, or if I'm not like prying into these things, like are they actually going to tell me? But really, like you know, kids pick up on whether you're a safe person to to say stuff to, or whether it's safe not to tell you stuff. So paradoxically, by making it safe, like not to say stuff to you or to say what they want, and some things and not other things, it may make you more of a safe person overall in the event that they are actually trans. uh, the other thing I want to say, and I always stress this, with parents, with schools, with anybody, any arena where there might be somebody who hasn't yet come out, whom you may have to accommodate or support. Basically, assume everybody could be trans. Assume like a child in general, even one who has not shown signs of being trans, could be trans, because it's not always the ones you suspect. It's not always going to be really obvious or really stereotypical, especially if they're in an environment, at school or in the larger world where there's not a lot of trans representation, or there's not a lot of acceptance of gender difference. So really, like you got to do the work of assuming that you know anybody you encounter in the world, or in, right there in your house, could be trans.
Yeah, I think the difficulty for a lot of parents is that that's not even on the radar, especially in
uh,
Christian households. That's not even a thought that could possibly be happening. So when a child is in that household and maybe at some point feels like a need to tell their parent, there could be a shock coming from the parent side, because that's something they never even thought could be possible.
yeah, that's definitely true. Like a lot of adults are just not watching for these things. So when a kid says I'm trans, sometimes the immediate reaction is like, what? You never showed any signs. You never said anything about it. But it's really on the adult to make it a safe environment to say something about it. There's this this tweet that gets passed around the trans community every couple of years. That's something like, trans person says, I'm trans. Parent says, what? You never showed any signs. And then in parentheses, it's like, parent would have killed you if you'd shown any signs. Obviously, in most households, it's not that dramatic. But when there's not a sense of positivity around gender, when there's not a sense that you can actually talk about these things and express yourself, like that sort of tacitly says like, oh my God, gender is taboo, sexuality is taboo. You really have to actively work to make it not taboo.
Yeah, absolutely. What is your advice for the parent who maybe is shocked by the news and is just feeling like, oh, this is just a phase that they're going to get through, and I just need to like kind of weather the storm?
Well, in the short term, I mean, this is what I see a lot in parents. There's this sort of urge to get every one of their anxieties, doubts, and fears right out in the open the first conversation they have about it. So their kid comes out, and their urge is like, okay, if I don't say something, if I don't air absolutely every doubt and fear that I'm having right now, then something bad's going to happen, or they're going to transition tomorrow, they're going to go get surgery, they're going to, do all of these other things that I'm so scared about. uh, and so I always urge parents to sort of go with uh, whatever their reaction is once they've calmed down a bit, to sort of check this urge to get their anxieties and fears. Because number one, obviously, like, this is what the kid is getting from all sides. Like, they're not just going to be getting anxieties and doubts from their parents. The entire world is going to be like, wait, are you sure? Are you sure? Are you sure? So, it's not as if the child is not going to hear those viewpoints. If anything, they're going to be hearing them 24/7. So I always encourage parents to just uh, listen, to sort of reflect their understanding, to be curious, uh, with the knowledge that there really isn't any permanent damage that you can do by listening and being curious and being open. In other words, parents will often be afraid that they're going to, like, somehow solidify their kid's trans identity, or make their kid believe that they're more trans than they are by affirming their gender identity, by calling them by the name and pronouns they ask them to call them, by taking them seriously. They're afraid that, this is going to somehow make things permanent and irrevocable, and that this is like a big long-term decision. And so a lot of my work is just getting parents to kind of chill, to be like, okay, you may not have come to an acceptance of this, and this is something you can get support from other parents, from me, from your own therapist. But by affirming your child, you're not banging the gavel and saying, uh, this is exactly what your life and your body is going to be like forevermore. No backsies, even if that might be true. Like, you affirming that kid is not going to move the needle on that. There's no evidence that affirming somebody's gender makes them more or less trans, or that not affirming somebody's gender, is going to snap them out of it. Like, it's just not the way gender identity works. So, in terms of, as therapists, we call it desistance. Some people call it detransition. So there's this huge fear, and this is the fear that every parent brings to me at some point. I mean, not every parent, but most parents, they hear something in the media, they read a scary story, and they think, well, my kid's going to be the one to desist in their gender identity, to detransition, and they're going to make all these changes, and then maybe they'll make physical changes, and they'll have to go back on it. And that's obviously scary for parents. But luckily, we do have a lot of research to show that that is incredibly rare. The studies I'm aware of, these are the three big ones. There was a UK study among, and we're talking about adults here, but I'll get to adolescents in a moment. There's a UK study that had around 3,400 participants, and of those participants, 0.47%, or 16, had some form of regret about their transition, or had detransitioned at some point. Now, it's important to contextualize detransition in that, like, not every time when somebody detransitions, not everybody who detransitions does it because they don't want to be that gender anymore. They don't feel as though their identity was valid. There are people who detransition because of outside pressure, because of discrimination. There are people who adopt a non-binary identity, whereas before they had more of a binary identity. Lots of different reasons. So of the people in that study who had regretted or detransitioned, 2 of them were thinking about detransitioning, 3 had detransitioned, and 10 of them had detransitioned temporarily. So, in other words, of about 3,400 people, only three had detransitioned permanently or apparently permanently. That's not a big number. It's not a big risk. Um, in a U.S. study, very similar results. It was a survey of I don't have the number off the top of my head, but it was several thousand trans people. Curiously enough, 8% had detransitioned at any point, but of the overall sample, only 0.4%, so similar to in the UK study, 0.4% had detransitioned because they actually regretted it. The remaining about 7.6% had detransitioned because of family pressure, because of religious pressure, because of community discrimination, stuff like that. So in other words, that really underscores the point that like family affirmation can, really harm trans people and really make them do stuff that they really don't want to do. In this case, something that I assume really disrupted their lives or caused them significant dysphoria. Now, when we look at adolescents, it does seem like the numbers are roughly similar. So there was a study in the Netherlands uh, of uh, of adolescents who went through a gender clinic and got on puberty blockers and eventually uh, transitioned to hormone therapy at the appropriate age. And of that sample, and this is a multi-decade sample, only 1.9% of them ever stopped
Wow.
treatment. And of course, it's hard to know whether somebody stopped treatment. Again, like there are reasons to detransition beyond like not wanting to transition. There are health reasons or social reasons. But I mean, I think that really underscores the point that that it's such a rare phenomenon. It's not something that's happening every day. It's just if you see it in the media a lot, it looks like every trans person is detransitioning, or like there's this enormous cohort rather than this very small slice of people.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to what you were saying before around that the fear that a lot of trans teens have about coming out, of not being believed. Maybe they've seen some of these articles that have gone viral about detransitioning, and that's just another proof that my parents won't believe me or my friends won't believe me. How does all of this impact the mental health of a transgender teen?
Yeah, well, what I'm seeing is, at least in the last couple of years, younger people really freaking out about these, this detransitioning being so prominent in the media. It's really making it seem like it's a phenomenon that happens to a lot more people than it does, and so for a lot of them, it makes them anxious, even if they're experiencing a great deal of dysphoria, even if they're 99.99% sure that they want to transition, even if they're not even considering physical changes, they're just considering social changes like a name or pronoun change or a change of wardrobe. They're seeing this as this enormously risky thing that also carries a great deal of stigma. If we were maybe kinder to people who detransition, who decided that it wasn't for them, it probably wouldn't be as big a deal. If we didn't catastrophize it and say, oh my God, that's the worst thing that could ever happen to anyone. If we were to say, okay, that's an option, it's not necessarily the end of the world, because there are a lot of detransitioners who don't regret having transitioned or experimented with hormones, or done some of these physical changes. There are a lot who expressed that it was something that they felt like they had to do to see if it was right for them. There are plenty who, like as I said, started out with one identity and later adopted another identity that was not necessarily like wholly in contradiction. In other words, people who start out saying like, I was assigned female at birth, but I am a man, and then later said, well, actually, I guess I'm non-binary. Like, that's not a tragic outcome. That's just kind of life. And more importantly, it was important that that person's autonomy be respected when they decided that they wanted to transition. If that person had not been allowed to, to see for themselves what they wanted to do, that really would have been the tragedy. That would have been, and then, you can think of like, if the other, 1,000 people who wanted to transition had been prevented from transitioning, just because there was this tiny chance, because there was this one person who decided it wasn't for them, like that also would have been a tragedy. So I do urge parents to look at the numbers and to not just weigh the risks of transitioning, but to weigh the enormous risks of not allowing a child to affirm their identity, because it really is a great risk.
I want to talk to you more about how to affirm our transgender teens' identity. Before I go there, you mentioned dysphoria, and I wonder if you talk a little bit about gender dysphoria, because I think sometimes parents who maybe have a transgender teen, they hear about gender dysphoria and they think, well, if I just solve this problem, they'll no longer be trans.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that that being trans until recent decades has been framed as a psychiatric problem, because like you said, it frames it, the dysphoria itself, as the problem to solve, rather than the body, or the social identity. So of course, a lot of parents are like, well, if therapy can change that, then why don't we fix the dysphoria and it'll all go away? But unfortunately, there really isn't any evidence that that works, and there's a lot of evidence that it doesn't work. I mean, it's telling that a lot of organizations that used to focus on what they call reparative therapy or sexual orientation change efforts are actually abandoning those efforts. You see a lot less of it than you used to, just because people, even these organizations that were willing to try, unethically, I would argue, it's even they are seeing that that people are, maybe getting out of these therapies and temporarily, saying, oh, I feel straight now, I feel cisgender now. But they're, it's really not, actual lasting change. It's, sort of them being told what they want to hear. So hopefully more states are going to go in the direction of not allowing its use in adolescents, at least. I mean, it probably shouldn't be allowed to be used on anybody, just because it's quackery. It doesn't work. But I really discourage parents from pursuing any efforts like this, because we've been doing this for 100+ years, and we know now that it absolutely does not work.
Um, and that brings me to another question around for parents that are looking for the right medical team, therapist to work with their child, their teen. What are some warning signs that they should be looking out for to make sure that they are getting affirmative care? Because there's lots of people that are out there that are saying that they're there to help trans people, but they may not be affirming therapists. They may not be affirming doctors.
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. I mean, there's this whole new crop of therapists, and you'll see books like this too, where they will not outright say that they are in favor of sexual orientation change efforts or gender identity change efforts. They will not outright say, like, we, they're not going to be like, we hate trans people, or it's not going to say on the cover, the trans sin, or whatever.
Right.
That they're getting sneakier. It used to be more socially acceptable to be, virulently anti-trans, and now you kind of have to be sneaky. Uh, but they're still sort of the same people. So I encourage parents, if they can't get from the website, or the public facing materials, that the practitioner is definitely trans affirming. If the practitioner is not trans themselves, or doesn't have like a solidly positive like web presence, number one, you can always call them. Uh, it's always a good idea to have a conversation and get that person to explicitly say, like, yes, I am an affirming clinician. I affirm a trans person's right to socially and medically transition. If that's what the team wants to do. Uh, there are also some directories that can help. WPATH is one, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. They actually have a provider finder, so you can go on their website, and it's just got a little search function, and you can find clinicians of any type, whether they're like an MD, an endocrinologist, or a psychotherapist, a psychologist, lots of diverse types of professionals. So I would encourage parents to use that resource. There are also some professional directories for transgender clinicians, and if you want to give those links to your listeners, I'd be happy to email them. So I mean, I would very much doubt that sexual and gender change, that reparative therapists would be in those directories. Never say never, but at least they're definitely not going to be in the WPATH directory.
Okay, great. And I'll make sure on the blog and also on the podcast notes to provide those links. So thank you for that advice, for that wisdom in choosing a proper therapist and a medical doctor. Going back to the importance of affirming our trans children, what are some ways that we can begin affirming them at home, and then also being advocates for them at their school?
So in terms of home, there was a study conducted with trans youth and their parents, in which trans youth basically said that the thing that my parents do to affirm me the most, like the thing that is the most important to me, is to just use my name and pronouns. And of course, there are other things, like allowing them to access trans affirming mental health care and health care, getting them to a doctor who understands gender identity. Even if they're not considering medical steps or not at that age where it would be appropriate. You know, Getting them access to a trans affirming, like, team of professionals. But really, like, the most affirmative thing seemed to be just taking their identity seriously. That was what that study concluded. And unfortunately, it seemed like in that study that was what parents were having the most trouble with. Like, maybe they could affirm them in other ways, but like switching name and pronouns was like the thing that they struggled with the most. I always tell parents, like, this is the free space of parenting. Like, this costs you nothing. This incurs no permanent changes. It doesn't do anything permanent or negative. It's free. So that's the one thing I tell parents all the time. In terms of advocating for them at school, there are a few people I usually have parents talk to. I mean, number one, I always encourage parents to talk to their kids about what the kids actually want them to do, because you as a parent, you want to help your kid. No matter what, you want to bring your advocacy can into the school and start firing. And your kid may have a different idea. Your kid may be like, no, don't talk to Mr. So and so. I just rather get through this class with minimal fuss. So first, have that conversation, like, what do you actually need? Do you need your teachers to use your proper name and pronouns? Do you need to get your name changed in the IT systems? So usually that's the first stop. Just the basic name and pronoun stuff. If you encounter resistance, if there's a sense that somebody's not playing ball, not complying with the law, and you escalate it, let's say to the principal or the superintendent, you can't make headway. Every school district is required to employ a Title IX coordinator. and that person can really be a good resource because they are actually accountable for enforcing the law in that area, and so they're the person who kind of says, who would say to the teacher, hey, dude, you have to use this person's pronouns. That's not optional. It's federal or state law. So that's a good resource. There are also the students always have the ability, if again, like if you escalate it and it doesn't go anywhere, to file a complaint with the Department of Education. You might be more successful advocating on the level of the school or the district, rather than going federal right away. But it's always an option, and I can provide you some links for information on that. The National Center for Transgender Equality has a lot of really good information for parents and kids advocating to schools.
That's fantastic. Really, really great advice. And I didn't know about the Title IX coordinator. That is awesome to know about that.
Yeah, it's also true of colleges. So if a student has issues with college, that's somebody who's required to be there.
That's wonderful. Um, Part of this affirmation process, not only at home and at school, depending on what your child wants to do, is also about talking to friends, relatives you see regularly, and maybe your teen is telling you, "Can you please let them know? I want to make sure that they're using my proper pronouns and name." And for the parent who may be in a religious space, a church, where they feel like that's not going to go over so well, these people may not be affirming. Um, how do you suggest parents kind of navigate those conversations?
So a lot of the time I ask parents, I say like it's a good idea to sort of set your boundaries beforehand, and that you can do in a in concert with your teen, because the teen is your kid is the one who has to kind of live with the consequences of that. So, to make a decision like, okay, so let's say they don't want to use this name and pronouns, or let's say the kid comes into the situation, they said they were going to do it but they're not doing it consistently, or they're making remarks that your kid finds offensive, which of course can happen. Like, to make a kind of contingency plan, like, okay,
Mm.
if that happens, what do we do next? Like, do we remove ourselves from this congregation? Do we speak to somebody in charge, in a family setting? Do we, temporarily stop attending these gatherings? Do we become more judicious about who we allow into our home or around our teen? You know, in other words, there are no boundaries without consequences. And, I think, what can happen in a lot of families is parents will say, well, okay, I told grandma or uncle or so and so, and they didn't do what we asked them to do.
Yeah.
So I guess there's nothing else to do. But, there is usually something else you can do. I mean, they are often, they're making a choice. If they're not making an active effort, to affirm the kid, if they're not, if they're saying things that are offensive or hurtful or invalidating, like that's not a neutral action. Uh, it's something they're actively making the choice to do. They're essentially saying, rather than being close to you and your child, I would rather continue doing these things that I want to do. So really, I always tell parents, like, you know, this is the thing that your child is going to remember. They're going to remember, not the times when you affirmed them when it was really easy to do so, when you were just making a happy Facebook post, but the times when really you're having to sacrifice, the times when you have to maybe make waves and be willing to let people be mad at you, be willing to raise your voice when your voice needs to be raised, and to modify relationships that are hurting your teen. That's what they're going to remember, the time when it was very hard for you, and
Mm.
very tense, and maybe very sad, and you did it anyway.
There's a lot of wisdom in what you just said. And when you brought up social media, because I get so worried about social media, especially for trans kids, because there's so much transphobia that's out there that they're seeing, so much toxic content that they could be consuming. Can you talk about maybe how to set appropriate boundaries for social media for our trans kids?
Yeah, this is something that that I see a lot in my younger clients. They will go on social media and they will just be kind of, and this is going to make me sound like a fogey because I use Instagram for pictures of like pies. Like
Yeah.
I'm not getting cyberbullet. I'm literally just looking at pie crust. It's and it's so. I mean, I think it can be very. If you're an adult, if you're over 30, you go on, you you may underestimate the scope of what kids are dealing with because you just have not opted into those circles. You may have not even had the known that these places exist. So one of the things that as I said before, like a lot of young people are being exposed to like very misleading like detransition narratives. A lot of younger people are being exposed to stuff that's not necessarily toxic, but that with repeated exposure could make you feel pretty bad about yourself.
Mm,
Uh, Bodies. Talk about like diets and weight loss and just a lot of like trans body standards that for a lot of people are just like not realistic. Transition narratives that may be super super easy for other people, and they're
mm,
looking at these these people with like a six pack, and they're obviously like that's going to make you feel a certain way about your body if you don't have a six pack. I mean, it's no different from what cis teens are dealing with. But with trans teens, there's the pressure from cisgender people to look a certain way, and then there's the pressure from transgender people sometimes, not everybody, but like in certain circles to like have a certain appearance. A lot of the times a lot of the time, many teens fear not saying the right thing, or making a mistake, you know, getting doxxed by somebody, getting hate mail. I mean, you wouldn't believe like what I've heard just like young kids getting like hate mail or death threats because, somebody thought that they said the wrong thing, they didn't like a piece of trans media. And, there are a lot of, very toxic subcultures, subcultures where it's very difficult to like exist as a trans teen without like warping your norms and your sense of like what is a civil way to act toward another person. So I mean, just in terms of concrete strategy, I always tell parents to be very careful about how you talk about like internet use, like because for a lot of kids, like the internet is their lifeline. Like it's not just toxicity. Most of it is not toxic. Most of it is just like giving and receiving support. It's beautiful. But if you as a parent, if your reaction to somebody, your kid coming to you and saying like, "I'm being bullied or stalked or harassed," is to say, "That's it. No more social media. No more internet." Uh, that's not going to probably stop them from using it. I mean, it might, and that would cut off a source of their support, and that would suck for them. But for it, for most kids, they're going to get access to it anyway. They're going to do it behind your back, and then if they really are in trouble, if somebody's like threatening them, if something really bad is happening, or somebody's like posting their pictures online, uh, they're not going to come to you if something bad happens. So I always say to parents like you can have conversations about is this a space where you feel good, or is this a space where you're feeling attacked. Is this helping you or hurting you? Having conversations about like bullying, or how to keep yourself safe online. Preventing people from getting like your address or your real name. Uh, but don't frame it as an or else. There shouldn't be like or else you can't use websites anymore, or else you can't go on this or that site that maybe all your friends are on that site, maybe all your support system is on that site. Uh, in other words, avoid anything punitive, because unless they're like doing something really egregiously bad, or harming somebody, uh, there really is no justification for taking away a teen's support system like that, especially when they may not have a local support system. They may not have people in school or outside of school that they're seeing who are trans or are supportive.
I wanted to ask you about the parents who maybe are a little bit struggling with what to do with all these older social media posts about their kids, the baby pictures and the older
Mhm.
name, the older pronouns. Obviously, it's a conversation between the parent and the child on what to do. But do you have any counsel, any wisdom to share with those parents as they're kind of struggling with what to do with that content?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of parents, it's not as much a technical as it is an emotional struggle. I mean, technically, it's not that hard to, like, on Facebook, you can limit the visibility of past posts. On some social media platforms, you can archive stuff, so you still have it, but it's not visible to other people. But for many parents, especially when it comes to things like physical photos in their home, or the way they refer to past events, they may feel as though like the child they knew is gone or erased. They may not feel as though they can acknowledge all those happy times that they have with their kid. However, I always encourage parents to sort of, I want to say, like, see the child that's in front of you. I mean, I've talked to a lot of trans adults, and trans adolescents, and a lot of them will say things like, "I feel like my parent, values old me more than new
Mm,
me." If their parent is saying things like, "Oh, you used to be so this," or if they're displaying photos of themselves before they socially or physically transition, photos that they don't like of themselves. I mean, it creates the image sometimes that the parent values the image they have of their child more than they value the actual kid who is
mm.
there and real. And so one of the most powerful things you can do as a parent, and again, easier said than done. This is, me, a therapist, saying this, but the parent is the one who actually has to do it. But the most valuable thing you can do is to set aside those emotions, and you can acknowledge them to yourself. You can say, I'm having a really, really rough time with this. I need to get this out to my adult friends. I need to tell somebody, to mourn, to sit and cry and look at these photographs. But I'm going to do the thing that the person in front of me is asking me to do, because that person is more important than this memory of them.
Yeah, no doubt. A very emotional period that the parent needs to sit with and think about.
Definitely. And this is why I always encourage parents to to get their own support. I mean, it's obviously, it's important to get support for your kid, but like, I encourage parents to be in therapy. I encourage them to go to parent groups. PFLAG has some amazing programming and groups. Is that there's stuff that you can say to your kid, and then there's stuff that you really have to get out in front of people who are not going to be emotionally affected by that.
Well, Andrew, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about ways that parents can be wise and help guide their trans teens. Before we go, any last minute tips you'd share with Christian parents as they're looking to um, navigate and be with their children in this journey?
Yeah, so I mean, especially for parents of faith, I want them to know that there are a lot of resources out there to help them. So there is a website called gaychurch.org. They have a directory of queer affirming Christian churches. You can search by location. There's a website called queertheology.com. They have resources for queer Christians and their families. Uh, they have resources on trans identity and Christian theology. That's queertheology.com/transgender. Uh, there is in addition to Christian parents, there are resources for parents of other faiths and for trans people of other faiths. There's the Muslim Alliance for Sexual and Gender Diversity at muslimalliance.org. There's Eshel, which is a Jewish organization, eshelonline.org. There's also Jewish Queer Youth, jqyouth.org, and Keshet, which is KESHET online.org. So there are many resources for support, for theological questions, for pastoral care around these issues, and additionally, I always recommend PFLAG just because they have so many resources, so many online resources, so many groups in person and Zoom, in pretty much every place in the United States. There's just a wealth of support out there. No parent has to go it alone.
It's beautiful. Andrew, thank you so much.
All right, thank you.